Colonel Marcus Ellison stopped for a quiet cup of coffee, but Officer Brian Keller saw only a suspicious black man in uniform. Seconds later, a taser dropped a decorated Army colonel to the floor and triggered a Pentagon protocol that would shake the entire Milstead Police Department. How does a moment of blind prejudice turn into a full-scale federal takeover? Share your thoughts below, and let's see exactly how this confrontation spiraled into a battle for justice. It was just after 7 on a cool Milstead morning, the kind where the air feels crisp and every breath carries the scent of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. Inside the Quick Brew Cafe, the lights cast a soft amber glow over polished wood tables. The radio murmured in the background, a news anchor calmly detailing a shooting 2 states away, just another tragedy spoken in the flat tone of someone who'd read too many like it. Colonel Marcus Ellison stepped through the door as if he'd walked into a place he already knew. Tall, broad-shouldered mid-40s, his uniform was perfectly pressed ribbons lined across his chest boots, shining. There was a stillness about him, the kind of steady presence you notice before you realize you're looking. He'd just finished a week of advanced training out of state and was on his way back to base. All he wanted was a strong cup of coffee for the road. The cafe seemed to shift when he smiled. A little boy at the corner table froze mid-bite, his eyes fixed on the metals. He tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, he's a soldier," the boy whispered. Marcus crouched slightly, his voice warm. "You like the army, son?" The boy nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Marcus grinned and leaned in for a quick picture. "Then keep working hard. Maybe one day I'll be saluting you." The boy's mother mouthed a quiet thank you as Marcus straightened and made his way to the counter. Behind it stood Maria Santos, the owner. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun, her smile practiced yet genuine. She was the daughter of a Vietnam veteran, and in her cafe, respect for service wasn't just a courtesy, it was a rule. "You just made that kid's whole year." "Colonel," she said, setting a steaming mug on the counter. "Happy to do it," Marcus replied, sliding a few bills forward. His mother should be proud. He's got that spark in his eyes. As Maria rang him up, her gaze dropped to the watch on his wrist, sleek, rugged military issue. "That's not something you buy at a department store," she teased. Marcus glanced down and smiled knowingly. "No. This one's special. Keeps me safe no matter where I am." It sounded casual, but there was something in his tone, a quiet certainty that made Maria pause. She leaned on the counter. "Safe how?" Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Let's just say it's part of the job. Some things you don't turn off even off duty." Maria let it go, but the words lingered in the air. The moment felt light, almost comfortable. But then the sound of a siren rose faintly in the distance, weaving through the quiet like a thread of cold air. It grew louder, closer. Maria's smile thinned. "That's the second one this morning," she murmured, glancing toward the window. A few customers looked up from their tables. One man shifted in his seat, craning his neck to see outside. Through the glass, a police cruiser appeared at the far end of the street. It passed slowly, then looped back. The driver's gaze swept the parking lot like a scanner lingering a little too long. Marcus didn't turn his head. He lifted his coffee, took a measured sip, and set it down with the same steady hand he'd used walking in. The air inside the cafe seemed to tighten, not loud, not frantic, just heavy. Maria leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Colonel, you expecting anyone?" Marcus's eyes stayed on his coffee. "Not the kind you mean." Outside, the cruiser idled now, engine rumbling low. A woman near the door muttered, "What's going on?" under her breath. No one in that cafe knew it yet, but the quiet of the morning was gone. Something was coming through that door, and it wasn't here for coffee. Draft of cold air, sharp and sudden. Officer Brian Keller stepped inside, white male, late 30s, broad build under his duty jacket. His jaw was tight, his eyes restless. Folks in town knew him for 2 things, a short fuse and a long memory. That morning, he was carrying both. Just hours earlier, Keller had botched an arrest, let the suspect slip right through his hands. The failure sat on him like a weight, mixing with something darker, the old resentment he carried toward anyone in uniform who wasn't a cop. Years back, he'd tried to join the army only to be sent home in the first week. He never forgot it. When the call came in, suspicious black male in military dress might be carrying. Keller didn't ask for details. Didn't care who placed the call. He grabbed the address and headed out like the universe had just offered him a chance to win something back. Now here he was standing in the doorway of Quick Brew. His hand rested casually on the grip of his service weapon, but it wasn't casual at all. His gaze swept the cafe, then locked on Marcus Ellison like a heat-seeking missile. Maria froze mid-pour, the hiss of the espresso machine, suddenly too loud in the silence. Around the room, conversations died mid-sentence. Even the radio seemed to lower itself. Keller started walking each step slow, deliberate. "You," he barked, pointing at Marcus. "On the ground. Now." Marcus turned, calm as ever, his voice steady. "Officer, my name is Colonel Marcus Ellison. Don't care who you are." Keller cut in, stepping closer. "You heard me. Down. On. The. Ground." Marcus kept his hands visible, moving with the kind of precision only a trained soldier has. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his military ID. "Sir, this is my identification." Keller snatched a glance at it, then gave a short, mocking laugh. "Oh, please, you picked this up on eBay." The words hit like a slap. The tone wasn't just disbelief. It was contempt aimed at the man, the uniform, and everything it stood for. A murmur went through the cafe, quick and sharp. Maria's knuckles whitened around the coffee pot. She didn't say anything, but her eyes locked on Keller like she was trying to will him to stop. Marcus stayed still, his voice low. "That's a federal military ID. I am on active duty. Not my problem." Keller shot back his hand, shifting from his holster to his belt, thumb brushing the taser. The air in the cafe tightened. No one moved. No one spoke. I remember thinking in that frozen moment how strange it was that a room could feel so small, like the walls themselves were leaning in, waiting to see what would happen next. I swear the air inside Quick Brew felt heavier the moment Keller's hand dropped to his belt. The faint buzz of the fridge, the low crackle of the radio. Everything else just faded. Marcus, still seated, kept his voice calm, almost too calm. "Officer, I'm on my way back to base. My orders are right here. You can verify." But Keller didn't let him finish. His eyes narrowed like Marcus's words were a personal insult. "Don't tell me what I can or can't verify," Keller snapped. "You think wearing that uniform makes you untouchable?" From behind the counter, Maria stiffened. Her hands trembled as she set down a coffee pot, eyes darting toward the small white-haired boy and his mother near the pastry case. She gave them a subtle wave toward the back door, her lips forming a silent, urgent go. The mother's face blanched as she took her son's hand and quietly stepped away, the little bell above the back door, giving the faintest chime. Keller's boots thudded against the floor as he closed the space. He planted himself in front of Marcus, his shadow swallowing the table. "Stand up, hands on the wall." Marcus didn't move right away. His voice was still level, but it had an edge now. "I've served this country for over 20 years, officer. I deserve." The sound cut through like a switchblade chack. The taser was in Keller's hand before anyone realized he'd drawn it. The metal prongs glinted in the warm cafe light. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the pop. Marcus's body jolted, muscles seizing his chair, skidding back into the wall. The coffee cup tipped dark liquid pooling across the table before dripping to the floor. His hat that perfectly kept army service caps spun off and landed by the cooler stocked with energy drinks, hitting the tile with a dull, hollow clink. The sound was small, but it cut deeper than any shout. Maria gasped. Someone near the window whispered, "Oh my God." The smell of burnt fabric mixed with the bitter scent of coffee and ozone. Marcus was on the ground now, breathing hard, the wires still attached to him. And in that haze of pain, something flickered behind his eyes. It wasn't just the shock, it was memory. For a heartbeat, Quick Brew faded. He was somewhere else. Sand. Smoke. The high-pitched whine of incoming fire. A young soldier screaming for a medic. And the faces he'd carried for years gone in an instant. The pain in his body now wasn't half as sharp as the one in his chest. Keller stood over him, taser still in hand, the corners of his mouth twitching in satisfaction. "Should have done what you were told, Colonel," he said, his voice dripping sarcasm over the title. Marcus slowly forced his gaze upward, locking eyes with the man. There was no plea in his look, no fear, just a deep, measured stillness. The kind of stillness that comes from someone who's seen worse and lived to tell about it. But Keller didn't see it. Or maybe he didn't care. The silence in the cafe was suffocating now, broken only by the faint hum of the coolers and Marcus's steadying breaths. Maria's knuckles were white around the phone she gripped under the counter, her thumb hovering over the screen. She knew one wrong move could make things spiral, but she also knew this had already gone too far. Keller holstered the taser like he'd just handled a routine disturbance. "Get him up!" he barked, to no one in particular. No one moved. It was then, in that frozen moment, that I realized Keller had no idea. No idea who Marcus really was. No idea what that small military-issued watch on his wrist meant. No idea that the man he'd just humiliated was connected to a power that could turn this small-town police department inside out before lunch. And Marcus, he just lay there for a moment longer, breathing the faintest trace of something unreadable in his eyes. Not defeat, not anger, something colder. He reached for his cap, his fingers brushing the edge of the cooler before picking it up. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. He dusted it off with the same care he'd give a folded flag, and without looking at Keller, placed it gently on the table beside him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only those closest could hear. "You don't know what you've just done." Keller scoffed, turning toward the door as if the conversation were over. But outside, the faint wail of a siren began to grow louder, closer. And while Keller might have thought it was backup, I saw Marcus's jaw tighten just slightly, like he knew exactly whose siren that was. And it wasn't the local police. For a long second, Marcus just stayed on one knee, catching his breath. His voice, when it came, was calm. Too calm for a man who'd just been dropped with a taser. "You just triggered the Pentagon's alert system," he said. Keller blinked, the words bouncing right off him at first, like he thought it was some kind of bluff. "The what?" Marcus lifted his left wrist slightly, the matte black watch catching the cafe's light. "This device," he explained, "is linked directly to Defense Department security. Any act of aggression against me anywhere in the country sends an instant alert to the Pentagon, the DOD, and the FBI." Maria, still frozen behind the counter, didn't miss a word of it. Her phone was already angled low, the red record dot glowing. She knew the shop's cameras had the whole thing too, but something in her gut told her she might need her own copy. Keller's jaw tightened. He tried to laugh it off, but his voice came out a little thinner than before. "Cute story." "That wasn't a story," Marcus replied. And that's when I noticed the first bead of sweat slide down Keller's temple. From outside, a faint low rumble began to grow. Not the high wail of local sirens. This was deeper, heavier. The sound of engines built for speed and authority. Through the window, a pair of black SUVs rolled into view, unmarked but unmistakably federal. Their tires crunched the gravel as they pulled in hard, followed by two olive-drab Humvees that stopped so abruptly you could almost feel the vibration under the floor. Maria's hand shook as she zoomed her camera toward the parking lot. "Oh, my God," she whispered. Keller stepped back from Marcus just enough to glance out the window. His posture stiffened the moment he caught sight of the gold badges gleaming against dark tactical gear. The first SUV door opened and a tall man in a navy jacket with bold yellow letters FBI stepped out. His presence filled the doorway before he even reached it. Behind him, two military police officers climbed out of the Humvees, their white helmet bands catching the morning light. The lead agent's voice was sharp-clipped and carried through the cafe like a command. Officer Brian Keller, step away from the man. This scene is now under federal jurisdiction. Keller's lips parted in protest, but before he could get a word out, one of the MPs strode forward, his voice just as firm. By direct order of the Pentagon, this incident is classified as a federal matter. You will stand down immediately. I swear you could feel the shift in the room. It wasn't just authority. It was takeover. Keller hesitated, his hand twitching at his belt as if debating whether to argue, but the FBI agent had already stepped closer, a folded document in hand. This is a formal order of scene control, signed and time-stamped. You're done here, officer. Maria glanced at me, eyes wide, like, did you just see that? Outside, the other SUV doors opened. More agents. One carried a slim black case, the kind that always looks like it belongs in a movie, the kind that holds either evidence or orders that end careers. Marcus, still steady on his feet now, gave no sign of gloating. He simply adjusted his cap, met the eyes of the FBI agent, and gave a short nod, the kind that passed volumes between men who understood chain of command. Keller tried again. I had a report, a suspicious individual. The agent didn't let him finish. That individual is Colonel Marcus Ellison, United States Army, with active clearance under the Defense Readiness Protocol. The moment you put your hands on him, you triggered an automatic priority alert. That's why we're here. The color drained from Keller's face. His gaze darted to the watch on Marcus's wrist, then back to the line of armed federal personnel outside. For the first time since he'd walked in, he looked small. One of the MPs stepped inside, planting himself between Keller and Marcus. His tone was almost casual, but there was no mistaking the steel underneath. Colonel, you're in our hands now. Sir. Marcus gave another small nod, but his eyes stayed on Keller. Not angry, not triumphant, just steady. The FBI agent turned to Maria, his voice softening. Ma'am, your cameras captured all of this. She nodded quickly, sliding him a small USB stick from under the counter. Backup copy, she said, just in case. The agent took it without hesitation. You did the right thing. Outside, the SUVs and Humvees idled their presence, a wall of silent force. Inside, you could almost hear Keller's thoughts rattling around, trying to piece together how what should have been a routine flex of power had just turned into a career-threatening spectacle. And yet, in the middle of all that tension, Marcus stood like the eye of a storm, calm, composed, and quietly aware that the situation had only just begun to turn. The air inside that cafe felt like it could snap. 1 second, Keller was still trying to stand tall. The next, the room was flooded with authority he couldn't touch. Special Agent Daniel Rivera from the FBI stepped forward, his tone cool but commanding. This establishment is now under federal control. All local officers disarm and step back. Beside him, Major William Cross of the military police echoed the order with the weight of military law. Pentagon directive. Lower your weapons now. The shuffle of hesitation was quick but telling. 2 local officers exchanged nervous glances before unclipping their holsters and setting their sidearms on the counter. Keller's jaw locked, but when Rivera's eyes locked on his, there wasn't an inch of give. Slowly, Keller placed his pistol on the counter, the metallic clink sounding like the end of something he didn't want to name. Maria, still clutching her phone, was suddenly guided behind the counter by one of the MPs. Ma'am, you're under federal witness protection for the remainder of this incident, the officer told her. It wasn't a request. Then the door swung open hard enough to rattle the frame. Deputy Chief Thomas Blake Keller's superior strode in with the kind of swagger that said he believed local power could still outrun the feds. Agent Rivera. he said, voice dripping with annoyance. "This is my jurisdiction. My officers. My call." Rivera didn't blink. "Not anymore, Chief. You're standing in the middle of an active federal intervention. Pentagon orders supersede your local authority." Blake smirked, like he'd been waiting for that line. "Then I'm exercising my right to place this individual." He nodded toward Marcus in temporary custody for questioning. "We'll sort the rest out later." The trap was obvious stall long enough for whatever incriminating footage existed to disappear. Rivera didn't give him the chance. Negative. Colonel Ellison remains under federal protection. Any attempt to detain him will be treated as obstruction of justice under Title 18, Section 1505. That's a felony, Chief. For a moment, the room went so quiet you could hear the steady hum of the refrigerators in the back. Blake's face reddened, but Rivera didn't move an inch. Major Cross stepped in, his voice low but with an edge sharp enough to cut steel. In addition, per Defense Command Protocol 7, all local facilities involved in this contact are now frozen, effective immediately. Rivera's radio crackled. Federal lockdown in place, moving to secure all police assets. Within minutes, unmarked bureau vans and additional military police units pulled into the street outside. A small tactical team moved toward the local police station 2 blocks away. Word spread fast. The entire department's servers, body cam archives, and dispatch logs were being seized under federal warrant. Keller stood off to the side, his face pale, his hands now empty. Blake muttered something under his breath, but the weight of the situation was finally settling in. They weren't in control anymore. Meanwhile, Marcus was being checked over by a field medic. The burns on his torso from the taser were already darkening, but his breathing was steady. When the medic gave the all-clear for transport, 2 MPs flanked him, guiding him toward the door. As he stepped outside, the street was lined with more federal vehicles, lights flashing in tight, controlled patterns. Across the road, bystanders had gathered, some filming, some whispering. And then someone recognized him. "That's Marcus Ellison," a voice called. "He's Army. That's a colonel." Phones shot up instantly. The sight of a decorated black officer being escorted by federal agents with local cops standing aside hit the internet like wildfire. Within minutes, clips from Maria's recording were already being uploaded. Keller's taser shot Marcus's calm warning about the Pentagon alert the moment the SUVs rolled in. By the time Marcus was helped into the back of a military transport, hashtags were starting to trend. Hatch Pentagon alert. Hatch Justice for Marcus. Officer Keller. Inside the cafe, Rivera turned back to Blake and Keller. "Gentlemen, you will remain available for questioning. Attempt to leave the county and you'll be picked up by federal marshals." Keller didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on the ground as if that would make the dozens of cameras and the truth disappear. Out on the street, the door of the military vehicle closed with a solid final thud. Marcus sat upright, hands resting calmly on his knees, his gaze steady on the horizon. Whatever storm had been unleashed here today, he was ready to face it head on, and the whole country was about to see why. The takeover of the cafe had barely settled when the deeper rot began to surface. FBI Special Agent Daniel Rivera didn't waste a second. He leaned toward one of his tech agents and said almost under his breath, "Start pulling Keller's jacket. And anything he's touched in the last 5 years." Within minutes, files started to light up on the agent's tablets, and that's when it came an ugly case from just last year. Corporal Derek Coleman, 26, black, and a decorated serviceman. Keller had put him in the hospital after a routine stop. Rivera's jaw tightened. As he read the rest, Coleman was forced to sign a falsified incident report while still concussed. The report was then buried so deep it took federal clearance to even find the archive tag. It didn't take a detective's eye to see the pattern. Keller wasn't operating alone. He was a blade sharp, visible, and disposable. Someone else was holding the hilt. Rivera's mind went straight to one name, Deputy Chief Thomas Blake. The man Keller called boss in public, but shield in private. A shield that had been blocking justice for years. The order came down fast: search the precinct before the locals could lock it down. What followed was a storm in steel-toed boots. FBI evidence teams and military police moved through the building like a tide room by room. Desk drawers were yanked open, file cabinets rolled into hallways. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat next to a shredder still warm to the touch. Piles of paper strips spilled across the floor like the confetti of a guilty celebration. In the back offices, hard drives were stacked in a cardboard box, labeled for disposal. Rivera's team bagged them along with every external disk and USB drive they could find. They knew the drill people like Blake always thought deleting a file was the same as erasing it from history. But in the right hands, nothing is ever really gone. Then came the part that made even seasoned agents stop and stare. An open laptop sat on Keller's desk, logged into his personal social media. The feed was a gallery of spite Confederate flags in profile pictures, racist memes, comment threads dripping with bile. One post read, "Real America is white America." Another mocked a black soldier's funeral. It wasn't just bad optics, it was fuel. Fuel for the fire already catching in the court of public opinion. Back at the cafe, Maria was seated in a booth, an FBI agent at her side. She'd been offered water, but her hands stayed locked around her phone. Not to scroll, not to post, just holding it like it was the last barrier between her and panic. Rivera approached quietly. "You've been through a lot today," he said, "but there's more you need to tell me." She hesitated, glancing at the door as if she half expected Keller to walk back in. Then she leaned forward and spoke low. "My father. Years ago, Keller harassed him. Said he was looking for trouble. Dad had never even been pulled over before. We filed a complaint, but nothing happened. Now I know why." Rivera didn't push. He just nodded, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. Behind them, a pair of agents in tactical gear swept the cafe one last time, securing camera footage and collecting any device that had recorded the arrest. Word of the operation was spreading beyond these walls. Phones buzzed in agents' pockets with messages from DC news alerts, even calls from Pentagon liaisons. It was clear now this wasn't just about a bad arrest in a small-town cafe. This was about a chain of abuse running from the sidewalk all the way into the shadows of the police command. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long bars of light across the street. Military SUVs idled their engines, humming low. People had gathered behind the yellow tape, craning their necks, phones raised high, catching glimpses of agents moving in and out. Some in the crowd were silent, watching like they'd just seen a ghost they'd been told didn't exist. Others whispered anger, threading through every word. Inside, Rivera stood by the window for a moment, watching the onlookers. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders said enough. He knew what this meant. Every move from here on would be under a spotlight, and not just from the media. Still, the mission came first. He turned back to his team. "Bag everything. Double chain of custody. We're not giving them a single crack to slip through." Maria looked up, her voice almost breaking Agent Rivera. "Will they really be held accountable this time?" He met her gaze, steady and sure. "If I have to drag them into the courtroom myself." The cafe felt smaller now, tighter, as if the walls themselves were holding the secrets that had just been pulled into the light. But outside, the world was already moving. The first live streams had hit social media. Keller's posts were being screenshot and shared faster than any takedown order could stop them. Somewhere across town, Thomas Blake was no doubt hearing about the raid, about the files, about the trail of evidence leading right to his door. And somewhere deep inside him, he had to know this time the shield might not hold. Rivera knew it too. And as he stepped out into the sunlight, the hum of the SUVs grew louder, a promise that the fight was only getting started. Because what had happened today was more than an arrest. It was the moment the shadows stopped being safe for the people who thought they owned them. By the time evening settled over the town, the story had already escaped into the wild. It wasn't the official press release that lit the match. It was Maria. Rivera had made the call himself, post the video he'd told her. If they know the world is watching, it's harder for them to make you disappear. So she did. A short, unshakable clip. Keller's rough hands on Marcus, the sudden arrival of armed military police, the words Pentagon protocol caught in the background. No captions, no commentary, just the truth, raw and unfiltered. Within an hour, it had been shared thousands of times. By midnight, it was everywhere. People paused in grocery store aisles, leaning over their phones. Restaurant tables turned quiet strangers, watching the same shaky footage, their eyes narrowing in disbelief. And then came the voices. Angela Roberts was the first to step forward publicly, a retired Army sergeant with a face weathered by service and years of silence. She filmed herself sitting at her kitchen table, medals displayed on the wall behind her. "I wore that uniform for 20 years, she began, voice steady but heavy, and I still got pulled over in my own neighborhood because I looked suspicious. No ticket. No reason. Just my skin." She paused, letting the weight of it sink in before adding, "Marcus isn't the first. He won't be the last unless we make sure of it." Her video struck a nerve. It was shared alongside Maria's, the two stories intertwining into something bigger. Soon, other veterans officers and ordinary citizens were posting their own accounts, moments when respect for the uniform had been erased by the color of the skin wearing it. By the next morning, the crowd had started gathering outside the police station. It began small, a few people with handmade signs, but by noon, the air vibrated with the sound of chanting. "Honor the uniform." They shouted the words echoing off the brick walls. Some signs bore Marcus's name. Others carried photos of fallen servicemen and women whose stories had never made the news. From across the street, officers stood in a tight line, arms folded, faces set in stone. But not all of them were still. In the quiet corners of the station, younger officers, rookies, and mid-tier ranks were passing flash drives under the table, slipping folders into brown envelopes. Documents, emails, complaint forms that had vanished from the system. One such packet found its way to Rivera's desk. Inside were sworn statements from officers who'd seen Keller falsify reports, intimidate witnesses, even plant evidence. But the most damning was a chain of emails showing Deputy Chief Blake personally ordering those cases closed. The fracture inside the department was no longer a crack. It was a split straight down the middle. One side wanted change. The other saw Keller as a wall protecting them from accountability. And that tension began to seep into the streets. Some off-duty officers in civilian clothes stood at the edge of the protest, watching with folded arms, muttering under their breath. One was overheard saying, "This town's turning into a circus," but others quietly, cautiously nodded to the protesters as they walked past a small gesture that spoke volumes. Maria stayed out of the spotlight, but her presence was everywhere. People recognized her voice from the video, and whenever someone mentioned her name in the crowd, there was a murmur of respect. She kept close to Rivera's team, knowing the threats would come. They already had anonymous calls, blocked numbers, messages telling her to stay quiet if you know what's good for you. But the noise outside was louder. Every chant, every sign, every live stream pushed the story further from the hands of those who wanted it buried. At sunset, Rivera stepped outside the station to take it all in. The golden light caught the edges of the signs waving in the air, the faces lit not just by daylight, but by resolve. Somewhere in that crowd was the real source of pressure, the kind that no badge or office could suppress. And inside the building, Blake was pacing. For the first time, the fortress he'd built out of influence and fear felt fragile. He could see it in the eyes of the officers who used to greet him with certainty. They looked past him now, toward the noise outside, as if wondering which side of the line they'd stand on when it all came crashing down. Rivera knew the storm had only begun. The community wasn't just reacting to Marcus's arrest. They were unearthing every buried wrong it represented. And in that kind of storm, once the wind shifts, it doesn't shift back. From the moment I walked into that courthouse, I knew this wasn't going to be a normal trial. The air was sharp, like it was holding its breath. Outside, the street was a sea of people, news crews shouting over each other, protesters pressed against metal barricades, camera flashes sparking like lightning. Inside, the tension was thick enough to feel on your skin. When Marcus entered, the room shifted. It wasn't just the uniform, though, that alone was enough to silence the chatter. It was the way he carried it. The rows of medals caught the overhead lights, each one earned in places most of us will never see. But his eyes, calm, unflinching, like a man who had faced worse than anything in this room. Keller sat at the defense table. His jaw locked his fingers, drumming just loud enough for those nearby to hear. When Marcus took his seat in the front row, Keller's gaze snapped to him cold, fixed, and full of something between hate and fear. The trial began. Keller's attorney rose, buttoning his jacket with the slow confidence of a man who thought he could spin anything. My client, he began, acted in the interest of public safety in a moment of uncertainty. But before he could finish, Rivera leaned forward at the prosecution's table, his voice cutting clean through the courtroom. "Play the video." The lights dimmed and Maria's footage filled the screen. Every detail was there. The unnecessary grip on Marcus's arm, the shove that sent him off balance, the flicker of pain he masked, and the moment his voice cut through Pentagon protocol. When the lights came back on, the jurors' faces had changed. That moment of uncertainty the defense spoke of now looked like something else entirely deliberate, targeted. Then came the files, recovered emails, falsified logs, witness statements Keller thought he'd buried for good. Angela Roberts testified, her voice steady, as she told the jury what it felt like to wear the same uniform as Marcus and still be treated like a suspect because of her skin. By the time the defense rested, their argument hung in the air like a frayed rope, one strand away from snapping. But the real fracture came when Keller took the stand. At first, he kept his composure short, rehearsed answers, a faint smirk, like none of this mattered. But then during cross-examination, Rivera asked Sergeant Keller, "Do you remember the exact words you said to Mr. Carter before placing him in restraints?" Keller hesitated. Then instead of answering, he turned to Marcus in the gallery. His voice rose just enough for everyone to hear. "You think that uniform makes you untouchable?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. The judge's gavel tapped once, a warning, but Marcus was already on his feet. "No." Marcus said, his tone calm but edged with steel. He stepped forward, every eye locked on him. "It makes me accountable. Accountable to the country I swore to protect. And part of that duty is making damn sure no one uses their badge to disgrace the oath we both took." You could have heard a pin drop. Even the judge's hand froze above the gavel. When Marcus was invited to speak formally, he didn't rush. He stood there for a beat, letting the silence do its work. "I didn't come here for revenge," he said, looking from the jury to the crowd. "I came here to make sure that what happened to me never happens to another service member. We fight for this country believing justice applies to everyone. If it doesn't, then the flag we salute is just a piece of fabric." No one moved. Even Keller stopped tapping his fingers. The judge leaned forward, her voice firm. "This testimony will be entered as pivotal to the court's findings. The verdict came fast guilty on multiple counts. Blake, too, was ordered to stand trial for obstruction and conspiracy." As the sentence was read, Keller's face drained. The man who had strutted into this courtroom now stared down at the table, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. Outside, the barricades could barely hold the surge of voices. Chants filled the air, some in celebration, some in sheer relief. Through the courthouse doors, Marcus stepped into the daylight. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. But in the set of his shoulders and the way he kept his head high, you could see it he'd won something far bigger than just his own case. If the trial had been the storm, what came next was the quiet. But it was the kind of quiet that changes the shape of things. The Milstead Police Department was no longer its own master. Within days of the verdict, federal oversight was announced, 5 years of constant monitoring audits and compliance checks. The kind of leash you don't take off until you know the dog won't bite again. Commander Sarah Mitchell was sworn in as the new head. She walked in without fanfare, a crisp uniform, and the kind of steady gaze that told you she wasn't here to be liked, she was here to clean house. And she started fast. Senior officials who had looked the other way for years were quietly removed, their offices cleared out before the end of the week. Mandatory anti-bias and civil rights training became part of the job. Not an optional seminar you could sleep through. A citizen review board was formed, real people from the community, with the authority to question, investigate, and, if necessary, demand action. Some officers left. Some grumbled. But the message was clear: the old rules were gone. And then there was Marcus. He returned to his unit, the weight of the case still visible in his eyes, but balanced by something else: purpose. He didn't talk much about the trial, not in detail, but he did something that spoke louder. One Saturday morning, he walked into a community center filled with teenagers, some in ROTC uniforms, some in worn hoodies, some who had only come because a friend dragged them along. He stood in front of them, not as a headline, not as the man in the viral video, but as someone who had been tested and hadn't broken. "I wore the uniform overseas," he told them, "but the hardest fight I ever had happened right here at home. And I won, not because I fought harder, but because I didn't let them take away who I was." He didn't preach. He didn't dramatize. He just told the truth, and you could see the way the room leaned in to catch every word. Maria, too, found her voice. She'd been the quiet witness, once the girl who could have turned away. Now she was stepping onto stages, speaking at universities and town halls about the power of evidence, how a single video, if protected, could pull the truth out from under a mountain of lies. "I didn't just film," she said at one event. "I kept the footage safe. Because proof means nothing if it disappears before the right eyes see it." Her words stayed with people. They stuck because they came from someone who'd lived it, not someone who'd read it in a book. In time, the crowds outside the courthouse faded. The news trucks left, and the chants became echoes. But the changes didn't vanish with them. Policies stayed. Oversight stayed. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the story of what happened in Milstead became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a blueprint. A blueprint for what could happen when the truth didn't just come out, but stayed out long enough to matter. The wind was sharp that morning, the kind that carries the faint smell of rain. Marcus stood alone at the memorial granite, polished to a mirror shine, names etched deep enough to outlast weather and time. He came to attention, his shadow stretching long across the stone. The brim of his cap threw a dark line over his eyes, but you could still read the weight in them. No cameras, no applause, just a soldier saluting those who had given everything. He let the names steady him, the way a coastline steadies a drifting ship. He remembered 2 of them, by voice alone. Griffin's laugh, Torres's dry jokes on long night watches. "We kept the faith," Griffin had said, once, even when nobody was watching. Marcus breathed in slow. This wasn't about vengeance. It never had been. It was about matching the country he loved to the promise he'd sworn to, closing the space between the flag and the life beneath it. The wind pressed his uniform flat against his chest. He could almost hear their answer in the snap of the colors. "Don't let the standard fall." For a long time, he didn't move. His hand stayed at his brow, the world around him fading to the sound of flags cracking in the gusts. But even here, even in this stillness, the storm hadn't fully passed. That morning's headlines told their own truth. Several of Blake's former inner circle were now under federal investigation, evidence, tampering, civil rights violations, conspiracy to obstruct. The rot had run deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Reform had begun, yes, but the work was only starting. Marcus knew it. He'd always known it. Justice isn't a finish line you cross once. It's a guard post you return to day after day to make sure no one slips past. He lowered his salute and let out a long breath, the kind you take when you've carried something heavy for too long. Then he turned from the stone and started the walk back toward town. Boots steady on the wet pavement, shoulders squared to whatever the day would ask of him. Near the square, the quiet gave way to the low murmur of voices, clipboards, checklists, the unglamorous work of change. Commander Sarah Mitchell was finishing a briefing on the City Hall steps, flanked by auditors and community liaisons. She spotted Marcus and crossed the distance with a purposeful stride. "Colonel," she said, offering a hand. "Oversight report goes live next week. Every complaint routes to a public dashboard. No more dark corners." "Good," Marcus said. "Transparency keeps people honest or nervous enough to try." A faint smile touched her mouth. "Both outcomes are useful." She glanced back at her team. "We'll need time and patience, but mostly spine." "You've got mine," he answered. They didn't linger. Two professionals acknowledging the same horizon, then moving on, sheet of metrics and audits. He to the crowd he now understood he belonged to as much as he led. The square opened in front of him. That's where the sound gathered, voices rising in chants, banners held high. The courthouse loomed behind them, its steps still crowded with people who hadn't stopped showing up, even after the cameras left. Some recognized him. Heads tipped, hands lifted in quiet respect. He answered with a small nod, no speeches, no grand gestures, just acknowledgement, soldier to citizen. On the edge of the crowd, Maria lifted a hand. No podium, no microphones, just a check-in. "You okay?" she asked. "Enough to keep watch," Marcus said. She tapped the phone in her pocket. "I kept the original drive. It's labeled logged and sitting in 3 safes. Not because I don't trust the system, because I do. And good systems expect proof." "You did exactly what the moment needed," he said. "So did you." They shared a brief, grateful silence, the kind earned by people who did the right thing when it was hardest, and then the crowd folded them back into its rhythm. Across the plaza, a boy on his father's shoulders waved a small flag. A woman in a worn ROTC jacket adjusted a hand-painted sign, "Honor the uniform. Protect the people." The faces here weren't the faces of a victory parade. They were watchstanders, folks who had decided the cost of looking away was higher than the cost of showing up. The City Hall bell struck noon. At first, it was just the bell. Then, somewhere in the crowd, a drum started, soft, patient. A boy's voice rose above the chant, high and certain. "Keep the standard." Others answered wave after wave until the words became more rhythm than sentence. Marcus didn't raise a fist or call for quiet. He just listened, letting the cadence write itself into the day. The bell faded. The chant held. He took one last look at the courthouse, at the steady line of people on the steps, at the flags, tugging hard against their poles. The fight would never truly be over. But that didn't trouble him. If anything, it clarified the assignment. He turned down the avenue, the heel of each step sure and even. From behind, you could see the shape of the life he'd chosen. Uniform, sharp shoulders, level head high. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The sound of the crowd followed him like a promise. Because what they'd won in that courtroom mattered, and what they guarded after would matter even more. If this story reminded you that justice isn't a single moment, but a daily choice of dignity, accountability, and community, keep that flame alive. The truth matters because people show up, speak up, and stand up. If it moved you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more meaningful, real-life narratives about courage and compassion. Tell us in the comments which moment stayed with you and why your support truly fuels our team at Mr. Mac's Stories to keep crafting high-quality stories with heart. And remember, our channels mark the shield and star. When you hear it, think of courage, truth, and community. See you in the next story.